Oh, how things can change in a short amount of time. A couple of weeks ago, Connor Weigman was seen as a top 10 draft pick and a future franchise quarterback in the NFL. At minimum, he was seen as a guy who could finally elevate Texas A&M football, and after 2 years of splitting time on the field due to injury and being the backup, it was his time to shine, and he could finally put it all together. Sadly, though, there has not been a case of a quarterback losing his draft stock quicker than Connor Weigman in 2024. Not only did he have the worst performance of any starting quarterback in college football in week 1 against Notre Dame, but then he got hurt, and all of a sudden, we are 3 years into his career, and his draft stock is probably dead at this point. There's a real chance that Marcel Reed will take over as the starting quarterback for A&M, and Connor Weigman went from on top of the world to all of a sudden a guy who's on the bench potentially. In today's video, we're going to take a look at the rise and fall of Connor Weigman. The video might be a little bit premature, but I did want to just highlight how good of a prospect this guy was, his time at A&M, and what ultimately has happened to him. But before we get started, if you are a big fan of college football, be sure to subscribe to the channel, leave a like if you support today's video, and let me know what player, team, topic, or situation I can cover next. Now let's get started and talk about what happened to Connor Weigman. So in order to understand how Weigman got to this point, we first need to go back in time. Growing up in Texas, Weigman was a huge deal, but he was not a fan of the Aggies. In fact, he grew up a fan of the famous Texas Longhorns, and one day he wanted to play college football. He grew up with a friend by the name of L.J. Johnson, and he eventually became a huge running back prospect, and they'd actually both play college football together one day. He was always an insane athlete, and he had a ton of promise coming through the local youth football system. When folks would walk up to Chad Weigman and his wife, they would tell them how impressed they were with Connor whenever he played, and they'd simply say, "Thanks, that's just Connor." Well, over time, the parents would expect their son to perform well, and he always would. They said, quote, "He's always been a naturally gifted athlete since he started at 4 or 5 years old. He's been blessed and obviously has a good work ethic, and he enjoys to compete, and that is one thing we instilled in him early, to go out and compete, and whatever happens on the field stays on the field, and to go from there." When he eventually arrived at Cypress Bridgeland High School, he played in 4 or 5 games as a freshman because of his crazy athleticism and his natural instincts for the quarterback position. Going into his sophomore year in high school, he originally was the backup, but ended up beating out the starter. That guy would transfer out, and Weigman went on to have a huge year, showing he was next up in the Houston area for high school quarterbacking. It would eventually pay off, as he was eventually named the District 6A Offensive Newcomer of the Year in 2019 as a sophomore. He passed for 2,500 yards and 27 touchdowns, and only had 3 picks. He also ran for 700 yards and 7 scores on the ground, and he led his team to the postseason for the first time in school history as well. At the time, there was a lot of buzz to his name, as Quinn Ewers had just decommitted from Texas, and this had caused ripples throughout the recruiting landscape. It forced Tom Herman's Texas program to go back to the drawing board, and eventually they would go down to Cade Klubnik and Connor Weigman. Ultimately, Cade would choose Clemson, but for a little while there was some traction for Connor Weigman to go to Texas. He did think it was a nice thought, as he did grow up rooting for the Longhorns, but eventually he realized that recruiting was more about fit and opportunity than playing for your favorite team from your childhood. So Texas was quickly taken off the list. As I said, his stock would soar as a junior, as he entered the season with a huge reputation as a baseball player as well. In fact, some scouts actually saw him as the best infield prospect for 2022, and his future in baseball could also help determine his college destination. He said, quote, "I'm looking for a place to play where I can play baseball and football, and a place where I can compete early." He was seen as a potential first rounder in the sport of baseball, and his first offer would come from Oklahoma, but for now, he was a bigger deal in the sport of football. Would he be the quarterback that would represent the Texas Longhorns? Well, no. It would not happen after all, but he did have a huge junior season. He ended up throwing for 3,800 yards and 42 touchdowns, and ran for 9 more on the ground, despite carrying the ball less than he did in 2020. He also turned the ball over a lot less, becoming more of a leader in the locker room, and won a ton of games, continuing his legacy as a big name in the area. After 19 schools decided to offer Weigman and his stock went through the roof, he was seen as a guy who could make all the throws, extend plays with his feet, and make a play when everything broke down. One Houston area high school football beat writer said, quote, "Now this is bold, but Weigman's mechanics, leadership, elusiveness, football IQ, and arm talent remind me of another Houston quarterbacking legend, Andrew Luck." Okay, yeah, that may be a little bit much, but his high school coach did end up also making a comment on the matter. He said, quote, "I faced Andrew Luck twice while I was in high school, and there are a lot of similarities for sure. Connor is the best I've ever had, as he has all the tools, and in a few weeks, every college football program in the country will have offered him. So where would Weigman end up going then? Well, shortly after he got to Texas A&M, he decided to bite on the Aggies and chose them over Florida, Oklahoma, and Baylor. Why Texas A&M? He said, quote, "I knew exactly what I wanted, and Texas A&M had it all. It's close to home, but it also has a foundation that it's building something big for the future, and I could come in and be a part of it." This commitment was huge for the Aggies, as his .9609 rating on 24/7 Sports made him the highest rated quarterback to sign with A&M since Kyler Murray did in 2015. So yeah, this was pretty big news for the A&M Aggies. Overall, in his senior year, he threw for 2,500 yards with 29 touchdowns and 9 more scores on the ground. He flew up recruiting boards and was eventually listed as a 5-star recruit, the number 3 quarterback and the 23rd best player in the class of 2022. So how did he end up doing in College Station? Well, let's take a look. So obviously, once Weigman arrived in College Station, he had a decent amount of buzz because of how highly he was recruited. He'd entered the 2022 season as A&M's third-string quarterback, and he was expected to redshirt and maintain his eligibility for another season. However, after a disastrous start with both Haynes King and Max Johnson, Weigman would have to be thrusted into the fold and would get an opportunity to play as a true freshman. In those 5 games that he played, he kind of was shaky, as he only completed 55% of his passes and averaged just over 161 passing yards per game. He did throw for 8 touchdowns and 0 interceptions, and his best performance came against Ole Miss, as he had 4 touchdowns and 0 picks in that one. He also rushed for nearly 30 yards per game, but sadly his production was still a little bit underwhelming. In total in 2022, he was okay. He also led them to that victory over number 5 LSU, but all in all, he was still a work in progress. Sadly, he ended up playing in 5 games, meaning he lost his redshirt status, and it was huge for him to get a little bit of taste on the field, and now there was higher expectations going into 2023, but he would end up getting in trouble. By trouble, I mean injury. He started out with 236 yards and 5 touchdowns against New Mexico, and then in week 2 in a loss to Miami, he threw for 336 yards and had 3 total scores, but had 2 costly picks as they lost by double digits. After that, he had 2 touchdowns and a win over UL Monroe, and then against Auburn, things fell apart. He went 8 of 14 for 70 yards and ended up getting hurt. He would miss the remainder of the 2023 season and would end up with 979 yards, 8 touchdowns, and 2 picks, with 2 more rushing scores on the ground. Unfortunately, a right foot injury would end up biting him bad, as he'd limp off the field in that game, and then Max Johnson and Henderson took over for the remainder of the season, and Marcel Reed even got an opportunity to play a little bit. Still though, everyone was talking about Weigman. None of those guys did enough to warrant any sort of real consideration at the quarterback spot. So going into 2024, Weigman was not only seen as a star, but he was seen as an NFL quarterback. In many mock drafts, he was projected to go top 10, and in a mock draft I reacted to a couple weeks ago, Weigman was supposed to go at pick number 6 to the New York Giants. He was a fascinating prospect who displayed a lot of high-level traits, but only played limited snaps. This was purely based on potential and not production, and so far in 2024, Weigman's stock is starting to completely crash. He's going from a guy who was supposed to be in the top 10 to honestly, he may not even get drafted if he goes at this point. So why is that? Well, there are currently 3 reasons. Well, 1, he doesn't have the production over the last 2.5 years to really warrant being drafted that high, and 2, there are some other major factors going on here. 1, his week 1 performance against Notre Dame was one of the worst performances we've ever seen from a starting quarterback in a high-profile game. Against number 7 Fighting Irish, Weigman went 12 of 30 for 100 yards without a touchdown and 2 interceptions, while also throwing for a 40% completion percentage and vomiting all over the sidelines in the 3rd quarter. I know that last part has nothing to do with the draft stock, but it kind of showed what kind of day he had. Ultimately, Texas A&M would lose 23-13, and Weigman looked terrible. Well, hopefully in week 2 he'd look a little bit better, and he kinda did. Against McNeese State, he went 11 of 14 for 125 yards and 2 touchdowns. He didn't get a chance to play that much, and it also came against an FCS team, so there really wasn't much stock to be put in that. What we did find out though was that he'd be out for week 3 against Florida, and he ended up suffering an AC sprain in his shoulder. This was now a 2nd straight year in which he suffered an injury, and finally, after last weekend, Elko updated us just a couple of hours ago saying, quote, "There's no updates on the plans for this Saturday. The imaging did turn out good, so we didn't find any more problems than we were dealing with. It's an AC sprain, and everything else is pretty much intact. Right now, he just needs to recover in rehab, and honestly, I have no idea how long the injury takes. I'm by no means any sort of physical therapist or a doctor, so this could be a thing for a couple of weeks. He could end up playing on Saturday, or he could be done for the year. I honestly don't really know at this point, but one of the big problems for Connor Weigman right now is that his backup Marcel Reed actually played pretty well. So yeah, everyone always thinks the backup quarterback's better, and in this case, I still don't know if I'd necessarily go with Reed, but last week, he had a decent performance. After going off in their bowl game last year, Reed ended up going 11 of 17 for 178 yards and 2 touchdowns in a road victory over Florida. Yes, I know it's Florida, but still, that's a pretty big deal for a redshirt freshman to go into the swamp and win a game like that, and he did have 2 touchdowns and looked efficient. The one knock on his game is that really most of those yards came from one big play, and he underthrew the ball anyways. Still though, Marcel Reed could be the guy moving forward because he just looks a little bit more confident right now. Connor Weigman, mentally, I don't know what's going on, and then add in the fact that there's all these injuries, makes me wonder what the heck is going to happen to him. It could either spiral out of control and he could end up never playing again, or Weigman can come back in 2 weeks, ball out, and play his way back into the top 10. For now though, Weigman looks like he's having the biggest crash of any quarterback this season, as he went from a guy in the top 10 to maybe not even getting drafted, or maybe not even throwing for 1,000 yards in a single season. Honestly, it's kind of sad to see. We'll have to wait and see what happens. If you're a big fan of college football, be sure to let me know your thoughts down below. If you're an A&M fan, what the heck is going on with Connor Weigman? What other players should I take a look at next? And before you go, don't forget to leave a like, subscribe if you're new, and check out all my other videos on the end screen. Hope to see you guys again soon, but until next time, peace.